Did you know a wild root growing under an Appalachian oak can sell for more per pound than gold? Every plant on this list pulls value from three directions at once: resale price, medicinal use, and culinary demand, which is exactly why these rank among the most sought-after wild edible plants in the country right now. Foragers who know what they are looking at are cashing in on backyard edible weeds worth real money, roots feeding a global herbal medicine industry, and greens chefs are paying premium prices for. And wait until you see the plant with a root worth more than $50,000 a pound, a price that gold itself struggles to beat ounce for ounce. Foraging has never looked this profitable. Grab a shovel, because your backyard just got a lot more interesting than you thought it was this morning. 1. American ginseng, Panax quinquefolius. A root that outprices gold does not announce itself. It hides beneath three small compound leaves and a modest cluster of red berries, low to the ground in a dappled shade of hardwood forest, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. Pull one up carefully and you will find a gnarled, almost human-shaped root that has driven entire economies since the 1700s. Colonial traders shipped tons of this root across the ocean to China, where ginseng remains a symbol of vitality and longevity in traditional medicine to this day. The root's age tells its own story to a buyer before a single word is exchanged. Wrinkled bark, tight compressed growth rings, and a slow, twisted shape signal decades spent underground, and serious buyers pay accordingly, often turning a root over in their hands the way a jeweler inspects a stone under a light. Younger, straighter roots pulled from cultivated fields bring only a fraction of that price, which is exactly why the wild version keeps its premium year after year. A typical dried wild root brings $500 to $1,200 a pound, but the rare specimens, gnarled roots aged 35 to 85 years with the deep compressed growth rings buyers prize most, have sold at auction for more than $50,000 a pound, a price that puts gold itself to shame. Beyond the medicine cabinet, thin slices of the root also show up steeped into teas and simmered into soups across Asian cuisine, giving this single plant a foothold in resale value, medicine, and the kitchen all at once. If you ever try wild ginseng foraging yourself, most states regulate the harvest with a strict fall season and require you to replant the berries exactly where you dig, both to protect the population and to stay on the right side of the law. Buyers also expect proper documentation before they pay top dollar, since ginseng is tracked under an international wildlife trade treaty, and roots dug outside the legal season are essentially worthless on the open market, no matter how old they are. That legal friction has not slowed demand from overseas. Export records still show tons of dried wild root leaving the country for Asian markets every single year, and prices tend to climb whenever a poor growing season shrinks the available supply. For a plant this small, it carries an outsized amount of paperwork, patience, and profit potential, and seasoned diggers guard their best patches the way some people guard a family recipe, passed down quietly rather than posted online. 2. Wild ramps, Allium trichocum. The smell hits you before your eyes ever find the plant, sharp and garlicky, drifting up from a forest floor that still looks mostly asleep after winter. Wild ramps grow in dense colonies under a canopy that is not yet leafed out. Broad green leaves and a slender white bulb that tastes like onion and garlic had a very good idea together, then decided to grow wild instead of in a garden bed. Ramps rank among the most sought-after wild edible plants in eastern forests, one of the first to break through the ground each spring, and Appalachian communities have foraged them for generations, celebrating their arrival with entire festivals built around the harvest. For families who had little fresh produce left by the end of a long winter, ramps were a nutritional lifeline as much as a seasonal treat, arriving right when the body needed green food the most, since early foragers also considered the sharp bulbs a natural spring tonic for shaking off winter sluggishness. Chefs discovered them decades later, and that old mountain tradition has since turned into a full culinary obsession in cities that never grew a single ramp on their own soil. Restaurants build entire spring menus around a window of only 3 or 4 weeks, and the plant generally cannot be farmed at commercial scale, since it takes 7 to 10 years to mature from seed in the wild. Patience most farms simply cannot afford. That patience problem has created real conservation pressure in popular foraging areas, and some states and national forests now cap how much any one person can harvest per season, or require harvesters to cut only leaves and leave the bulb behind so the colony survives to grow back next spring. Responsible foragers treat a healthy ramp patch the way a good fisherman treats a favorite stream, worth protecting precisely because it keeps paying out year after year, and worth ruining in a single careless afternoon if it is not. 3. Bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. Why would a plant bleed when you touch it? Brush against a single white flower rising from the forest floor and snap its stem by accident, and a thick orange-red liquid oozes out immediately, looking unnervingly like the plant has been wounded. That startling fluid is exactly how bloodroot earned its name, and it has been valuable for centuries, long before anyone thought to attach a price to it. Native American tribes used the root's vivid pigment to dye textiles, baskets, and ceremonial items long before European settlers ever set foot on the continent. The compound responsible, sanguinarine, is powerful enough that the plant is never eaten, and that same intensity is precisely what makes it valuable elsewhere. Handled carefully and used only externally, it became a serious ingredient in dye work, natural cosmetics, and early dental care formulations. Bloodroot once appeared in commercial toothpaste and mouthwash as an anti-plaque ingredient before those formulas were discontinued over safety concerns tied to internal use. Even after being pulled from store shelves, demand from herbalists, natural dye makers, and researchers studying its effect on skin growth has never really slowed down, which keeps the price volatile and, in strong years, genuinely striking for a plant most people have never heard of. Identification matters enormously here, since bloodroot's early spring flower can be confused with other white woodland blooms before its distinctive lobed leaf fully unfurls. Serious foragers wait until the leaf wraps around the stem in its signature shape before digging, both to confirm the species and to avoid disturbing the colony before it has finished setting seed for the following year. That kind of careful, patient foraging is exactly what separates a sustainable harvest from a patch that never recovers. 4. Goldenseal, Hydrastis canadensis. Its color gives it away long before its price does. Tucked into a shady ravine, a cluster of wrinkled, hairy leaves sits above soil hiding a knotted yellow rhizome that looks like a piece of turmeric root that wandered into the wrong forest. That golden hue is no coincidence, since the same pigment was once extracted directly and sold as a dye in its own right. Cherokee healers passed their knowledge of this plant to early American colonists, who folded it into some of the most trusted remedies of frontier medicine. Its bitter alkaloids made it a staple for digestive complaints and minor infections for 2 centuries straight, and its reputation only grew as word spread far beyond the communities that first relied on it. Unlike many edible weeds on this list, goldenseal never carved out a culinary niche. Its value has always run almost entirely through medicine cabinets and resale markets instead of kitchens. That long history of demand eventually caught up with the plant itself. Goldenseal is now listed under an international treaty that regulates trade in threatened species, meaning a special permit is required just to move it across borders legally. Wild populations have shrunk so severely from decades of overharvesting that most commercial supply now leans on managed forest farming rather than true wild harvest, and buyers increasingly ask for proof of sustainable sourcing before they will pay top price for a root. Some growers have responded by planting goldenseal directly beneath existing forest canopy instead of clearing new fields, a method known as forest farming that mimics the shady, undisturbed conditions that plant needs anyway. It grows slower than a field crop, often taking 5 years before a root is worth digging, but it produces a plant that looks and tastes identical to true wild stock, which matters enormously to buyers trying to protect what little wild goldenseal remains. 5. Elderberry. Sambucus canadensis. Reach into an unassuming shrub growing along a fence line, one you have probably walked past 100 times without a second glance, and dark purple clusters hang heavy just above your head. Elderberry ranks among the most recognizable wild edible plants in North America, quietly waiting at the edge of forests, ditches, and backyards for someone to remember exactly what it is good for. European folklore once treated the elder tree as sacred, believed to be inhabited by protective spirits, and old traditions have even instructed people to ask the tree's permission before cutting its wood. That reverence grew out of hard practical experience passed down through generations. Elderberries were simmered into syrups, wines, and preserves that carried families through cold seasons long before anyone understood the vitamin content behind why the remedy actually worked. That old home remedy has become a modern immune support industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars, with elderberry syrup lining pharmacy shelves every single winter. The berries you could pick for free from a hedge in your own yard are the exact same species, processed, bottled, and marked up once they reach a store shelf, which is worth remembering the next time you consider buying a bottle instead of stepping outside with a basket. Harvest timing matters more with elderberry than almost anything else on this list, since the berries must be fully ripe and cooked before eating, and the raw stems, leaves, and unripe fruit contain compounds that cause nausea. Once you know what to look for, though, a single mature shrub can produce enough fruit for a whole season of syrup, with plenty left over to share or sell. 6. Black cohosh. Actea racemosa. Its nickname sounds like a warning label. Black snake root grows as a tall white flower spike rising nearly waist-high above dark, jagged leaves in a shaded summer hollow, and pulling gently at its base reveals a thick, black, knotted rhizome that earned the plant its unsettling name, one far more sinister than the actual demand behind it. Native American tribes across the Appalachian region used this root for generations, and by the early 2000s, it had become one of the most searched herbal remedies for women's health, particularly for symptoms related to menopause. Its rise in popularity happened fast enough that wild populations struggled to keep pace with demand, and buyers began competing hard for the same limited supply of roots. By the mid-2000s, most major herbal buyers named black cohosh one of the 3 hardest botanicals to reliably source, even as consumption climbed into the hundreds of thousands of pounds annually across the supplement industry. Almost all of that supply still comes from wild harvested plants rather than cultivated fields, which keeps black cohosh foraging a steady autumn tradition across the Appalachian Mountains, digging roots that will end up in supplement bottles a continent away from where they grew. Sustainability groups now track black cohosh alongside ginseng and goldenseal as a species worth watching closely, since its slow growth rate means over-harvested patches can take a full decade to recover. Buyers who care about long-term supply increasingly pay a premium for roots harvested using selective digging methods that leave younger plants in the ground to mature. 7. Echinacea. Echinacea purpurea. Picture an open prairie clearing in late summer, wind moving through tall grass, and a spiky purple flower head standing above it all, its cone-shaped center bristling like a tiny hedgehog, which is exactly where the plant gets its name. Echinacea has been pulled from the American plains for centuries, valued long before it ever reached a single drugstore shelf. Tribes including the Sioux and Comanche used it for a wide range of traditional remedies, and its reputation eventually traveled overseas with European settlers who folded it into their own medicine cabinets. Ironically, echinacea was briefly dismissed by mainstream American medicine, with the American Medical Association declaring its use quackery in 1910. That dismissal did nothing to slow it down in the long run. The plant exploded in European herbal markets instead, and returned decades later as one of the most popular cold remedies in the world, a comeback few plants ever managed to pull off. Some foragers also toss the fresh petals into salads or steep them for a mild, earthy tea, placing echinacea alongside the more common edible weeds on this list, even though its real fame comes from the immune remedy aisle. Today, it sits in nearly every pharmacy's immune support aisle, packed into teas, tinctures, and capsules, all built from a wildflower that still grows freely along roadsides and untended fields across the central and eastern United States. If you want to grow your own supply at home, it establishes easily in full sun and tolerates rocky, dry soil far better than most plants in a home herb garden. Unlike several other plants on this list, echinacea has adapted well to cultivation, which has actually taken real pressure off wild prairie populations. Commercial growers now supply most of the raw material behind that pharmacy aisle, which means the version you plant at home is contributing to the exact same supply chain as the wild stands that first made the plant famous. 8. Wild yam, Dioscorea villosa. Everyone assumes that wild yam, tangled in their own backyard, invented the birth control pill. It did not, and the real story is stranger than the myth. Unlike most wild edibles on this list, it is also not something you should eat raw, since its natural bitterness and mild toxicity make it a plant valued for chemistry rather than dinner. A thin, twining vibe climbs through the underbrush, heart-shaped leaves spiraling toward the tree canopy, and following it down to the soil reveals a knotted tuber that shares its name and part of its chemistry with one of the most consequential plants in modern medical history, just not the credit for the discovery itself. The wild yam growing in American woodlands, Dioscorea villosa, contains a compound called diosgenin, but it is actually a related Mexican species harvested from the jungles of Veracruz that chemist Russell Marker used in the 1940s to synthesize progesterone in a laboratory for the very first time. That breakthrough eventually made large-scale production of the birth control pill possible, and it happened almost entirely because of a Mexican yam known locally as the barbaresco, not the plant growing quietly in a Missouri forest. The American backyard version still gets sold today as a wild yam supplement or topical cream, often marketed for hormone balance, but clinical research has found that the human body cannot actually convert diosgenin into progesterone on its own the way a laboratory reaction can. The chemistry made history. The backyard plant mostly just borrowed the fame that came with sharing a name and a genus. That has not hurt the American wild yam commercially, since herbal supplement buyers rarely draw the line between species as carefully as a chemist would. It still gets dug, dried, and sold under the same name that once launched a global industry, which means a vine growing wild on an Ohio fence now is riding on the reputation its Mexican relative earned nearly a century ago. 9. Osha root, Lingusticum porteri. The scent stops you before the plant does. Hiking at high elevation in the Rocky Mountains, a strong, celery-like smell cuts through the thin air, sharp and unmistakable even before you spot the fern-like leaves at your feet. Osha root grows only in this narrow mountain range, and no amount of effort has ever managed to make it grow reliably anywhere else on Earth. Native tribes, including the Zuni and Apache, called it bear medicine, after noticing that grizzlies emerging from hibernation would dig up the root, chew it into a pulp, and rub the mixture onto their own fur before moving on. Runners carried pieces of the root for endurance on long journeys, and it was burned as incense to ward off illness and misfortune, a practice that continues among some communities to this day. That same celery-like sharpness has also earned it a small culinary following, with a few southwestern cooks using shaved root as a wild seasoning, though it never joined the ranks of common edible weeds, and most of the plant's fame still rests on medicine and resale rather than the kitchen. What makes the osha genuinely rare is not tradition alone, it is biology working against every attempt to cultivate it. The plant depends on a specific underground fungal partner to survive, which means it flatly cannot be farmed outside its native mountain habitat, no matter how carefully growers try to replicate the conditions. Every ounce sold commercially still has to be dug directly from the wild, and suppliers increasingly sell it by the ounce instead of the pound, since the price keeps climbing as wild stands shrink under steady demand from herbalists. Conservationists have grown concerned enough about osha's slow decline that some botanists now recommend treating it as an at-risk species, even without formal legal protection in most states. Because it can be confused with a genuinely deadly relative in the same plant family, most experienced foragers recommend learning to identify it directly from someone experienced rather than relying on photos alone. 10. Mayapple, Podophyllum peltatum. The cheapest root on this list might be the most important one. Mayapple stands apart from most wild edible plants on this list since only one small part of it, the fully ripened fruit, is ever safe to eat. Duck under a small canopy of umbrella-shaped leaves in a shaded woodland, and you will find, hidden beneath that leafy cover, a single white flower and a long creeping root system connecting what looks like several separate plants into one hidden colony. Mayapple looks harmless from a distance. It is anything but harmless once you understand its chemistry. Every part of this plant except its fully ripened yellow fruit is toxic, and the root contains a compound called podophyllotoxin, capable of stopping cell division entirely on contact. For most of history, that made mayapple dangerous to handle carelessly, something wild harvesters learned to respect rather than fear outright. In the 20th century, that same toxic chemistry made mayapple valuable far beyond anything its raw root price would ever suggest to a casual buyer walking past it in the woods. Chemists used podophyllotoxin as the chemical foundation for semi-synthetic chemotherapy drugs still administered in cancer treatment today, including etoposide, used worldwide against lung cancer and certain leukemias. The raw root itself sells for only a few dollars a pound to local buyers, a strange contradiction for a plant whose chemistry quietly underpins medicine used in hospitals around the world every single day, far from the forest floor it came from. Because natural podophyllotoxin extraction is slow and the wild supply is limited, pharmaceutical chemistry eventually moved toward semi-synthetic production methods that only start with the natural compound before finishing the process in a lab. Even so, the entire chemotherapy application traces back to the same toxic root that colonies of mayapple have been quietly growing under forest canopy for longer than any hospital has existed. From a root that outprices gold to a toxic weed hiding a cancer drug inside its own chemistry, these 10 plants prove that value in nature rarely announces itself with a price tag. It hides in ravines, fence lines, and mountain slopes, waiting for someone curious enough to look twice at what everyone else has already written off as a weed. Whether you were looking for common edible weeds along a fence row or something rarer up a mountainside, the value has been there all along, just uncatalogued. Some of that value comes from centuries of tradition, some from pure biological stubbornness, and some from a laboratory discovery nobody could have predicted from looking at a plant growing wild in the shade. Which of these would you go looking for first? This is Stellar Eureka, signing off.